I don't think Cloud Atlas is necessarily a bad movie, but it is kind of hard for me to recommend. It's enjoyable and an overall great performance across the board. From the actors to the producers, everyone does a really good job. But it's clear early on that it's striving to be so much more. But by the end of the movie, you realize that it never reaches that plateau that it was aiming for, which is a real shame, especially considering the $128 million budget. The problem I have is that Cloud Atlas's narrative isn't that compelling. The characters aren't given enough time on their own to grow, and as such, it's difficult to get attached with what's going on. This makes the movie feel pretentious. Despite having the right recipe for success, it relies too much on the setup, but never does anything with it. Even if you've never seen this movie, you've probably heard of its ridiculous premise back when it was still relevant. It's basically 6 separate but interwoven stories that span across time and space. The film jumps back and forth between them constantly, alluding to similarities found in seemingly unrelated characters and situations, all of which are tangentially related, but somehow in significant ways. Most of the actors have totally different roles depending on the time period, and although each story hits similar beats along the way, they do manage to remain fresh on their own. The makeup and costume design deserves high praise, as each time period is pulled off very well, and the different actors changing between each time period is really cool. Sometimes though, it does feel pointless, like the fact that it's impossible to tell that this character is supposed to be portrayed by Halle Berry. You're just supposed to find out in the credits and go, oh wow, I had no idea. Well, yeah, no duh, you had no idea, look at her. But anyway, it does work more often than not, and it is a really cool idea that was pulled off effectively. The daunting number of characters and the very idea of juggling 6 different stories at once is what made me wary to watch this movie in the first place. But after finally giving it a chance, that turned out to be the least of my worries. A big part of the reason why this movie was easy to follow was thanks to the phenomenal editing, which mostly utilizes match-on action techniques. Like this moment where a fugitive walks across a narrow bridge in the future, cuts to a sailor walking across a ship's mast in the past. It's a classic tried and true film technique, and Cloud Atlas is probably the ultimate example for teaching this to students learning how to edit. It not only makes each scene flow seamlessly, but it also shows in what ways the different time periods are significant to each other, and it further enhances the storytelling experience, all without using any actual dialogue. And any time that a movie can effectively use show but don't tell automatically gets points in my book. The special effects are mostly good, but I feel like they could have been better, especially considering the budget. I guess most of the money went towards the all-star cast. The overuse of special effects is mostly seen in the futuristic setting, like this motorcycle that looks a little bit cartoony and fake, and there's a background scene that shows a factory which looks awfully blurry for some reason. But to be fair, there's also this standout scene of the Papa Song Diner, and that totally makes up for it. What isn't as awesome is how unsubtle this movie is. It's trying to run with this butterfly effect kind of a theme, how the past affects the future, but it hammers that point a little too hard, and the amount of times it's alluded to started to make me feel numb to it. There's also a pretty childish amount of racism in this movie.
Nobody tells me what I can and cannot do on my own ship, especially when it concerns nigger stowaway.
Stupid fucking wetback. Fucking migrant monkey dog. Why do they hire these greasy subs?
It's that lazy writing trick where you make the bad guys more hated by making them do something mean just for the sake of it. Like, just in case the audience wasn't sure who to root for? Well, this guy is racist. It's so dumb. I get that it also fleshes out the culture of the time period, but it does come off as a little forced, especially when it's only ever the bad guys who are racist. It's also worth noting that the primal time period of the movie utilizes a made-up dialect. I like it a lot, I think it's a great idea. On the other hand, it's nearly impossible to understand what anyone is saying. You can get by with subtitles, which I always use anyway because I like subtitles, but this is a rare movie where subtitles are practically required, and it's only for this time period.
Nay, this life o' rotted luck ain't no smiley Samyani. In rare's time I ever fessed the secret of Slucha's Hallow. Adam, my bro by law, and his son and me be trekking back from Honokaa Market. Was Adam's custom to kowtow his ancestry with offerings and honorings. Nay, this life o' rotted luck ain't no smiley Samyani. In rare's time I ever fessed the secret of Slucha's Hallow. Adam, my bro by law, and his son and me be trekking back from Honokaa Market. Was Adam's custom to kowtow his ancestry with offerings and honorings.
I said earlier that the great editing helps make the movie easy to follow. Another reason why this jamboree of varied plots flows so easily is because the important characters are kept very limited. Each of the individual stories only has 3 characters to keep track of: the main character, the main supporting character, and the main antagonist. While there are more, the rest are mostly filler. Not only that, but all the stories go by so quickly that there's not even much of a point to keeping track of their names. Just keep in mind the general plot for the given time period and you'll be fine. Unfortunately, as you might have guessed, because each plot is so small and unsubstantial, it's difficult to get attached to what's going on, or otherwise have a reason to care. These are all good characters, and each individual segment might have made for a decent movie on its own, but most of the plot progression and character development loses its meaning due to not one single scene being given the chance to breathe. Everything plays out and moves along too quickly for the audience to care about what's happening. Instead of each story being properly fleshed out, they're all just a bunch of outlines. You have the characters, you have the settings, now do something more than just generic with them. But it never happens. Cloud Atlas's entire narrative is designed around the smaller pieces telling an overarching narrative. The film as a whole isn't necessarily about these smaller stories themselves, but rather the ways that each of these stories affect and relate to the others. This is why so many actors play so many different characters throughout the time periods. It's as if they're being reborn again to affect the world anew. It carries that all too familiar message of humanity repeating the same mistakes, but always being given another chance at redemption. The theme could have been more subtle, but I'll give them credit for at least trying. It's an ambitious movie for attempting to do something so out of the box, and it reminds me of other movies and games with non-linear narratives, like Pulp Fiction, Memento, and 999. But Cloud Atlas is weaker than each of those for an important reason. It never has an anchor for the audience to hold on to. Each of the comparisons I mentioned have a pretty convoluted story that goes all over the place, but they also have a memorable cast of characters and a gripping plot that keeps the audience invested. What Cloud Atlas features are a collection of casts of characters and a handful of plot lines, none of which are even given the chance to stand on their own and also suffer from predictable endings. Sadly, all of this is kind of a necessity. It had to be done this way because the medium of film doesn't give a lot of wiggle room when you're trying to tell an epic of this size. This is what weighs Cloud Atlas down. It was originally a novel, and I could see this working out better as a book since it gives the reader plenty of time to immerse themselves in that world. But as a film, the narrative has to constantly keep moving, and Cloud Atlas is already almost 3 hours long. Yet, for as long as it is, Cloud Atlas needed to be even more to truly be effective. But that simply was not going to happen. This is a story that's not meant for the medium of film, at least not film as we know it or that's reasonable to produce. Breaking this up into a series of sequels as individual movies would be way too expensive to produce, while turning it into a TV show might make it feel like it's stretched out way too much. Like I said in the beginning though, it is an enjoyable movie. It's visually impressive, it's paced well, and the acting is good. However, it's also very forgettable. I just watched the movie 2 days ago and I can't remember most of the characters' names. What makes me most upset about Cloud Atlas is that it was able to fumble its way through to a passing grade by having a strong cast and crew. But the movie on its own merits, particularly the story and the way that it's told, isn't really anything special. It's kind of worth checking out just because it's pretty neat, but you're not missing out on much if it doesn't sound like your cup of tea.
Oh, Satan's gonads not again. Look, just bugger off and leave us in peace. I'm only going to ask you nicely once.
Thank you for watching my review on Cloud Atlas. If you'd like to be updated on my future videos, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel or follow me on Twitter.
I've had a minor run-in with the wrong sort. If I don't get my hands on £60,000, I'm going to take an awful beating.
Well, get them to video it for us, would you? Now, fuck off.